Every morning before I leave the house, I tear off a 2-inch strip of duct tape and put it in my shirt pocket. My wife stopped asking why. My kids think it's just a dad thing, like checking that the stove is off or rattling the doorknob twice. It is not a dad thing. Every night, wherever I sleep, hotel, guest room, my own bed, I reach up in the dark and press that tape over the zipper pull of whatever I'm lying nearest to. I know that makes no sense in a house. A zipper pull on a bedroom door doesn't exist, but my hands still reach. My hands remember what my brain is trying to forget. I worked as a wildlife camera technician for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for 4 seasons. I was contracted to maintain and retrieve SD card data from motion-triggered trail cameras across roughly 60 square miles of the Richland Creek Wilderness in Newton County. Black bear population monitoring mostly, occasionally elk, sometimes wolf sign, which officially doesn't exist in Arkansas, so we didn't write that part down. I quit on a Tuesday in October. I didn't file the paperwork until Thursday because I couldn't stop shaking long enough to type. The card I pulled from camera station 14 recorded something outside my tent for 11 hours and 22 minutes. I know the exact runtime because I have watched it 431 times, and I have never once made it to the end. The Ozarks in early October are the most dishonestly beautiful place on earth. I say dishonestly because the color does something to your judgment. When the hardwoods along Richland Creek turn, the white oaks going rust, the hickories going gold, the maples bleeding out in shades that have no right to exist in nature. The whole wilderness looks like something from a children's book, safe, contained, like the kind of place where nothing bad has a permanent address. I drove in on Forest Road 1205 out of Boxley Valley every Monday morning, a beat-up Arkansas Game and Fish Commission pickup with a locked box of tools in the bed and a cooler of food behind the seat. The road wound past the Richland Creek campground, past the trailhead bulletin boards with their orange bear warning laminate peeling at the corners, and then up into the wilderness proper, where the pavement ended and the forest closed around the truck like a hand. The creek itself ran cold and clear even in dry years. I could hear it from most of my camera stations, this low, continuous sound like static, like white noise from a machine left running in another room. I loved that sound. It meant I knew where I was. There were 61 cameras on my rotation. I'd serviced them for 3 seasons before this one, swapping cards, replacing batteries, clearing brush that had grown into the frame, occasionally resetting cameras that deer or hogs had knocked sideways. I knew every station by feel. I could have walked the whole grid blindfolded and found each camera by the nail I'd driven into the specific tree, the particular bend in the trail, the way the light fell at 4 in the afternoon on a northwest-facing slope. This territory had belonged to a man named Dale Pruitt for 11 years before I took it over. Dale trained me my first season, drove me every inch of that 60-mile grid, showed me his system, the way he numbered stations on homemade wooden plaques, the way he flagged his card pulls with blue painter's tape so he never swapped a fresh card into a slot that hadn't been read yet. He was 61 years old and had the hands of a man who had spent decades outside. He knew the name of every hollow and ridge in that country. Dale disappeared in October, 2 seasons before this story. His truck was found on Forest Road 1205, engine cold, driver's door open. His tools were in the bed. His GPS was in the cup holder. The battery had been pulled from it. That was the detail that got into me and stayed. Not the open door, not the cold engine, the pulled battery. Dale knew every procedure. He wrote half of them himself. Nobody goes home the same from country that has taken someone they love. The rules for working the Richland Creek grid weren't in any official game and fish manual. They lived on a single laminated sheet pinned inside the equipment shed at the Boxley Valley station, and they had been there so long the laminate had yellowed at the edges. The header said, Field Protocols, Richland Creek Wilderness, October through March. Below that, 8 numbered items in Dale's handwriting, which I recognized by the way he made his 7s with a crossbar through the stem. I'm going to tell you what they said, because understanding what happened to me requires understanding the weight those rules carried, not just as procedures, as a system, as something that had been earned. Rule 1. Do not position cameras with east-facing orientation along Richland Creek drainage after October 1st. East-facing only. Not west, not north, not south. East. I asked Dale about that my first season and he said, "The light's wrong in the morning." I wrote it down and didn't push. Rule 2. If a retrieved SD card contains timestamps from hours during which you were not present at that station, do not review the card alone. Do not review it in the field. Drive it directly to the main station and log it as a corrupted file. This was the one that lived in the back of my skull. Not review it alone. I had reviewed hundreds of cards alone. I had never thought twice about it until I read that rule. Rule 3. 3 knocks on any hard surface after dark. Tree, rock, your vehicle, your equipment box. Do not respond. Do not knock back. Do not speak. Stop moving and wait. Rule 4. After 9 p.m., no white light. Red filter on your headlamp only. Red filter on your flashlight. If your red filter breaks or is lost, use no light at all and do not move until morning. Rule 5. If wildlife sound drops within a quarter mile of your position, birds, insects, creek frogs, stop moving immediately. Stay still for a minimum of 10 minutes before proceeding. Rule 6. Pull the battery from your GPS unit before sleep. Do not leave it running overnight. I remember reading this and thinking it was about battery conservation. I was wrong about that. Rule 7. Always review footage at the main station, never at the campsite. This was the rule I broke. This is the rule that changed everything. Rule 8. If you find a camera that has been physically rotated from its original orientation, do not touch it. Do not adjust it. Radio in immediately and wait for a secondary technician. The man who replaced Dale as my field supervisor was a game and fish lifer named Gary Aldridge. Gary was quiet, the way men are quiet when they've already said everything important out loud at least once, and found that it didn't help. My first season working under him, he drove me out to the equipment shed, pointed at the laminated sheet, and said 2 sentences. Dale wrote most of those because something happened that made him write them. He paused for a long moment, looking at the yellowed laminate. Some of those rules, he said, are newer than they look. I learned about the last time a technician had broken Rule 7 from a woman named Carla Mosser, who had worked the Buffalo National River Corridor camera system for 6 years before transferring to the Boxley station the season before mine. She told me the story over a truck tailgate at the Richland Creek trailhead parking area on a morning so cold our breath hung between us like something solid. She said the technician's name was Marcus Webb, 26 years old, 2nd season. He'd been doing a late pull on a string of cameras near the east bank of Richland Creek, the same drainage that Rule 1 addresses, and had gotten turned around trying to make it back to his truck before dark. He camped, rather than risk the road in the pitch black, which was the correct call. He set up his tent, ate a cold dinner, and then, because he was bored and the night was long, he put his laptop on his sleeping bag and started pulling cards. He called Gary at 11:53 p.m. Carla had been in the station office that night, heard Gary's side of the call. Gary said, "Don't move. Stay in the tent. Don't use any light except the red filter. I'm coming." Gary drove 45 minutes on Forest Road 1205 in the dark. When he got to Marcus's campsite, Marcus was sitting outside the tent with his laptop open on the ground in front of him, screen still lit. He wouldn't go near the truck. Gary had to half-carry him. Marcus quit the next day. He wouldn't say what was on the card. He did say one thing, though, according to Carla. Gary had asked him what happened right before he called, what made him pick up the phone. Marcus said, "It stopped looking at the camera and looked at me." I remember Carla watching my face when she finished, the way she let the silence sit there. "You understand he was inside the tent," she said, when he said that. I drove the 55 miles home that evening, thinking I finally understood the weight of those rules. I had the shape of the danger right, I thought. I had the outline. I was certain enough to feel prepared. That certainty was the most dangerous thing I brought into the field with me. The first 3 weeks of October were clean. The grid was performing well. Good bear activity. 3 confirmed elk sightings in the upper Richland drainage. 1 extraordinary sequence from Station 31, showing a black bear sow teaching 2 cubs to fish a seasonal pool that only ran after heavy rain. I was 2 days from completing my October card pull. 60 cameras serviced, 1 station left. Station 14, my easternmost camera, positioned on a low ridge above the main Richland Creek channel, approximately 4 miles from the nearest trailhead. I always saved Station 14 for last because the hike-in was long and the terrain was steep, and by the time I reached it, I was usually tired enough to stop appreciating the view. On that last day, I decided to camp at the base of the ridge rather than hike out in the dark. Completely standard, something I had done a dozen times. I pitched my tent in a clearing I'd used before, a flat shelf of ground between 2 large white oaks, with the creek running below and the ridge above. I had my full kit, sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, 2 days of food, a red filter headlamp, a backup flashlight, my radio, my GPS unit. I cooked dinner on a camp stove as the last light went amber through the hickories. I was happy. I want you to understand that. I was genuinely happy out there. That country had been hard on me since Dale, but that evening felt like something lifting. I pulled the battery from my GPS unit before dark and put it in my breast pocket. I had done everything right. Station 14 was a problem when I reached it the next morning. The camera had triggered over 400 times in 17 days. That was not unusual for a high-traffic corridor. Bears, hogs, deer, the occasional coyote, but the trigger log showed a dense cluster of activations between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. across multiple nights. Something had been walking that ridge after dark, repeatedly, in the same general window. I swapped the card, flagged it blue, and put the fresh card in. I was standing there with the old card in my hand, thinking about Rule 7, drive it to the main station, do not review it in the field. Then I thought about Dale. Dale had been alone out here. Whatever had happened to him, he had not had the chance to call it in. I told myself that what I was doing was responsible. I told myself that if there was something on this card that explained Dale, I needed to know before I hiked out. I told myself if there was a real threat, I should see it before I had to walk 4 miles through the dark back to my truck. Every one of those things was a version of the truth. None of them were the actual reason. The actual reason was that I had been carrying Dale's disappearance for 2 years, and I wanted an answer badly enough to break a rule for it. I broke Rule 7. I sat down against the base of a cedar tree, pulled out my laptop, and loaded the card. The forest went quiet around 10 seconds into the first file, not gradually, all at once. The creek frogs, the wind in the hickory crowns, a pair of crows that had been calling somewhere down the drainage. Gone. One moment, the world was full of normal sound, and the next, it was holding its breath. I closed the laptop. I looked up. The ridge above me was still. The sky between the canopy was the flat gray of late morning. Nothing moved. I waited 10 minutes, exactly as Rule 5 required. Then the frogs came back. The wind came back. The crows started calling again from somewhere lower on the slope. I told myself it was a raptor. I told myself the card could wait. Then I opened the laptop again. The first file that flagged my attention was from 11 days prior, 2:57 a.m. The camera's motion sensor had triggered on nothing I could identify. The frame showed the cedar and scrub oak corridor above the creek, the exposure grainy and green in the IR illumination. There was no animal in the frame. There was no movement that I could see. But the camera had triggered, and in the upper left corner of the frame, at the very edge of the IR throw, about 40 feet from the camera, there was a shape against the base of a boulder that I couldn't assign to anything. Not a deer bed, not a shadow from the canopy. It was the wrong density for shadow. It was the wrong geometry for any animal I could name. I told myself it was probably a bear, partially obscured. I moved to the next file. The next file was 43 minutes later, 3:40 a.m. The shape had not moved. The shape was in the exact same position against the boulder. In 43 minutes, through multiple triggering events, wind, probably, or small animals moving closer to the camera, the shape had not shifted a single degree. A bear does not hold still for 43 minutes at 3 in the morning. Nothing holds still for 43 minutes. I felt the cold then, real cold, coming up from the ground through my boots, not from the air. I was sitting against that cedar with my laptop balanced on my knees, red GPS lanyard around my neck, my reflective game and fish vest, catching the gray October light. If you had taken a picture of me from 40 feet up the ridge, you would have seen a man who was trying very hard to look like he was not afraid. You would have seen the laptop screen throwing pale light on my face. You would have seen, above and behind me on the ridge, something that I did not yet know was there. I kept scrolling through files. By the 5th file, I understood that the shape was not staying still. It was moving between frames in intervals that left no motion blur, no transitional position. In one frame, it was against the boulder. In the next, triggering event, 17 minutes later, it was 8 feet to the left, and the geometry of it had changed. Longer now, or differently angled, in a way that made me feel like the perspective had shifted, even though the camera had not moved. It had 3 joints in its forward limbs, where there should have been 2. I noticed this in the 9th file, and I stopped breathing for a moment. Not an extra knuckle, a full additional joint, bending in a direction that the human brain resists categorizing because it does not match any template it holds. The limb came down to the ground at an angle that suggested weight, but the grass under it showed no compression. No compression. Something with visible mass and apparent weight was resting its limb on the grass and leaving no mark in it. The smell hit me then. I want to be precise. I was outside, against a cedar tree, with a slight breeze coming up slope from the creek, and I suddenly smelled iron and wet bark, the specific smell of a fresh wound in a living tree, like the sap and copper smell when you cut into green wood. There was no cut tree near me. The smell had no source. I looked up from the laptop screen. The ridge above me showed movement at the tree line. Not the movement of an animal walking. The movement of something repositioning, like a person shifting their weight from one foot to another. But the silhouette that produced the movement was wrong in its proportions. Too tall for the underbrush it was standing in. The head, if it was a head, did not resolve into anything familiar. The shape of it against the gray sky was like a word in a language I didn't speak. I did not move. Rule 5. If wildlife sound drops, stop moving immediately. I had been sitting still for 20 minutes. The sound was still gone. I was already in compliance with the rule, and I realized with a terrible clarity that the rule was not about compliance. The rule was about not drawing attention. The rule was about being something the forest did not need to categorize as a problem. I reached, very slowly, for my radio. It was on. The squelch was open. There was nothing but low static, that clean white noise of a channel with no traffic. Then, once, at low volume, 3 clicks. Not a voice. Not a distress code. 3 evenly spaced clicks, like someone keying the transmitter 3 times deliberately. Rule 3. 3 knocks on any hard surface after dark. Do not respond. It was 11:47 a.m. I did not respond. I did not move. I set the radio down in the leaves beside me, with the kind of careful, slow placement you use when you're trying not to make a sound, and I kept my eyes on the ridge. The shape at the tree line was gone. I made it back to the campsite. I do not fully remember the 4-mile hike, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I know I walked it. I know I arrived at the clearing between the 2 white oaks before 3 in the afternoon. I know I checked my tent, found it exactly as I had left it, and got inside. I did not try to hike out. The road was 4 more miles. The light was going to be gone in 2 hours. I had my full kit. I told myself the right move was to stay still until morning, and maybe that was true. I pulled the tent zipper shut. I turned on my red filter headlamp, and I sat with my back against the interior of the tent wall facing the door, and I waited. At 9:47 p.m., by the time stamp on my phone, I heard the first sound. Footsteps in the leaves outside the tent. Slow, deliberate, circling, counterclockwise. I want to tell you I held it together. I held it together the way a cracked thing holds together, by not moving, by not adding any additional stress to the fracture. I sat in the dark with my red light off, and I did not make a sound for 4 hours, while something walked a slow circle around my tent, close enough that I could hear the individual leaves compressing under each step, close enough that once, I heard that iron and wet bark smell come through the tent fabric like it was pushing through the nylon from outside. At 2:17 a.m. it stopped circling. It stood outside the door of my tent and was still. I felt it the way you feel a car beside you on the highway going the same speed. That awareness of mass in proximity that doesn't require sight. It was there. It was directly outside the zipper. And in the silence, without moving, without touching the tent, without making any sound at all, it communicated something to me. Not in language. Not in anything I can diagram or prove. The closest I can get is this. It had been watching me all day, and it wanted me to know that it had been watching me all day, and it wanted me to understand that the watching was not incidental. It was the point. It was doing what I did. It was cataloging. I thought about Rule 6 then. The GPS battery in my breast pocket. Dale's GPS battery pulled, sitting in his cup holder. Dale had known this rule. Dale had followed this rule, and Dale was still gone. The rule wasn't about battery conservation. The rule was about not being a signal in the dark, about not broadcasting your location in a frequency something out there could read. I put my hand over my breast pocket. I could feel the battery through the fabric. I did not move. I made the only choice available to me. I stayed still and I waited for morning, and I let it watch. At 5:53 a.m., the light through the tent fabric shifted from black to gray. I heard the creek frog start up below the ridge. A crow called. The forest sound came back in a single wave, the way it had gone, all at once. I waited 20 minutes after full light. Then I unzipped the tent. I examined the ground around the tent in a full circle. The leaves were compressed in a clear track, counterclockwise, close enough that the outermost impressions were within 18 inches of the tent wall. The track showed a stride length I could not measure with my hands because the impressions weren't footprints in the conventional sense. They were compressions, weight-distributed elongated marks that might have been feet or might have been something else making contact with the ground in an irregular pattern, except in one place. At the door of the tent, there was a single clear impression, a forward limb, or something functioning as one, pressed into the soft soil. 3 points of contact, 3, where a bear's front paw would make 5, where a human hand would make 5. 3 points, in a triangular arrangement, with the middle point deepest, as if the middle joint had borne the most weight. No compression in the grass, but compression in the bare soil where the grass had worn away. I loaded my pack, and I walked out of there without looking back. I was in my truck with the engine running when I remembered the second camera. For 2 seasons, I had been running a personal security camera, a small trail unit, not commission equipment, aimed at my standard campsite from a tree 40 yards out. I had never told Gary about it. It was not a proud habit. It was the kind of thing you do when you work alone in country that took someone you loved. I pulled the card from it sitting in the truck cab with the doors locked and the heater running. The camera had been triggered 68 times between 9:47 p.m. and 5:41 a.m. Every frame showed my tent, lit pale green by the IR, with the circling track visible in some shots as a blur at the edge of the frame. Most frames were empty except for the tent and the darkness and that counterclockwise blur. In the final frame, 5:41 a.m., 12 minutes before the creek frogs returned, 12 minutes before I registered that the forest sound had come back, the camera had captured something at the edge of the IR throw. It was facing the security camera directly. It had found the second camera. It had known there was a second camera, and in the last frame before it left, it had turned to face it, in the same way Marcus Webb had described. It had stopped watching the tent and looked at something else. It was looking directly into the lens from 40 yards out. In that frame, for the first time, I could see the face with clarity. I'm not going to describe it. I'm going to say that it was looking at the camera with an expression I recognized, not because it resembled anything human, because the expression itself was human, in function, if not in form. It was curious. I filed my resignation that Thursday. I cited personal reasons. I never submitted the security camera card as evidence of anything. I don't know what I would have said it was evidence of. Gary called me twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. 1 month later, I received a forwarded email from the Commission's data team. They had processed the cards from my final pull, including Station 14. The email flagged an anomaly in the metadata. The timestamps on the Station 14 card were running exactly 1 hour ahead of actual time, not a battery glitch. The previous card from the same station had run correctly. Something had changed the internal clock on that camera. 1 hour ahead. The whole time it had been there. The whole time I had been reading those files under the cedar tree, the timestamps had been lying to me. The cluster of late-night activations I'd attributed to 11 p.m. through 2 a.m. They had been happening between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. 1 hour earlier than I'd read them, which meant the footage of it standing absolutely still for 43 minutes had not been from 3:40 a.m. It had been from 2:40 a.m. 2:40 a.m. was when I had arrived at the campsite and pitched my tent. It had been on that ridge, watching the campsite before I got there. The duct tape in my pocket is about the zipper. I know, rationally, that tape on a zipper pull doesn't do much. It doesn't lock. It doesn't seal. It is 2 inches of adhesive on a piece of fabric. But here is what it does. It tells me whether the zipper has moved. If I wake up at 3 in the morning in my own bed in my own house and I reach up in the dark and the tape is gone, then I know. My wife thinks I have anxiety. I do have anxiety. My therapist thinks the camping incident triggered a trauma response and that the tape is a grounding behavior. My therapist is not wrong. But neither of those things is the whole story. The whole story is that I lay inside a tent in the Richland Creek wilderness for 8 hours while something circled me in the dark, and it never tried to come in. Not once. It had been there when I arrived. It knew I was there. It tracked the exact perimeter of my shelter for 8 hours, and it chose not to come in. I have thought about that choice every single night for 2 years, because Dale followed the rules. Dale pulled the battery from his GPS. Dale knew that country better than any person alive, and whatever choice the thing in the dark made about Dale, it was a different choice than the one it made about me. I don't know why. I have spent 2 years building theories and tearing them down. The one thought I can't shake is this. Every trail camera I serviced in that grid was mine. My eyes on the forest. And the thing in the dark had spent 11 seasons being watched by human eyes without ever appearing on a card, without ever appearing in a single documented record, until it decided it wanted to. The last file on the security camera was not the last frame on the card. I told you I have watched the Station 14 footage 431 times and never made it to the end. I haven't watched the security camera card since the morning in the truck. It's in my equipment box in the garage, behind the spare batteries and the labeled Ziploc bags of blue painter's tape. I know it's there. I think about it the way you think about a door you've decided not to open. The tape on my zipper pull is still there this morning. I checked before I sat down to write this. I'm going to go check again now. This account has been preserved in the Richland Creek Field Documentation Archive under case notation 14 OCT. If you've worked remote camera grids in the Ozarks or anywhere else and pulled a card that you've never talked about, the archive is listening. Subscribe. The next record is already being transcribed.